My name is Mark Pelka. I'm Undersecretary of Criminal Justice Policy and Planning at the State Office of Policy and Management. Happy to be here and look forward to getting our first meeting underway. Thank you, Dr. Corbett.
And Kaisha?
Yes, hi, I'm Kaisha Velasquez. I am a licensed mental health therapist, and I also am an adjunct professor at Albertus Magnus College and Postsecondary Community College, and I am a lifelong resident of New Haven, Connecticut, bilingual, and very excited about being part of this team.
And I also just want to thank Jeannie Phillips, who has worked diligently to help bring this group together and coordinate so many of the different pieces that are important. We would not be able to have this meeting without her. So thank you very much, Jeannie. And so I am going to share my screen. I just have a little PowerPoint to share with folks. Ideally, as I mentioned, we convene the meeting and are having introductions. I'd like to go through the task force goals as outlined in the Public Act. And have a couple of discussions around sort of institutional eligibility and what that means for the higher ed institutions and kind of the guidelines within which they are working. And then also briefly talk about the newly released Ed Department regulations and guidelines that have come out for the reinstatement of Pell, which happened under the Consolidated Appropriations Act. And then there will be time for questions and then outlining next steps, trying to set the next meeting, and then we will adjourn. I always try to make sure that these meetings start and end on time, so I may speak a little quickly through some of this information to make up for some time, but please, anyone on the task force, stop me if I am going too quickly. So I just want us to be really clear and kind of have this picture about how we are thinking about, talking about stakeholders in this very important work. Obviously, our students are situated in the center of the intersection of institutions of higher ed, as well as the DOC. Both institutions of higher education as well as the DOC are beholden to guidelines that are outlined by accrediting bodies that govern, for institutions of higher ed, program capacity, financial aid, boards of trustees that make institutional policies. DOC is also beholden to accreditation levels, whether it is around the quality of facility structure, how the leadership is going, and also for education with a lot of work in the Correctional Educators Association and being accredited for the education programs through them. The DOC also has its own school district, its own vested school district, Unified School District 1, which does a lot of the adult basic ed and GED programming. And my hope as an educator, and certainly a hope that I hope folks share on this task force, is that we can also begin to talk about how the study for the feasibility of this post-secondary education office in the DOC can start to create a feeder almost between students who complete their GEDs and the college programs that are offered inside of the correctional facilities. And so this is just an infographic that takes a look at just a few of the stakeholders that we are kind of beholden to in the broader sense in terms of who we are responsible to, who we are accountable to outside of our accrediting bodies. Oops. Okay. I promise I know how to use PowerPoint. So the goals and objectives of the task force, again, are outlined in the Public Act 21-132, Section 2. So we are going to be covering as a group sort of pre-existing roles. So who is currently coordinating higher education and prison programming, including non-Pell programs? We know that for the Second Chance Pell experimental site programs, there is a coordinator within the DOC who has worked specifically with those programs, but that person does not work with the programs that do not access Pell. And so we want to really outline what the roles are that are in existence, what the needs are for roles kind of moving forward with the reinstatement of Pell, and how those things can be streamlined. We also need to think about the selection process. What are the current steps for approving programs inside? I think for those of us that have programs running inside, it was a pretty simple, process. But I think as, again, with the imminent reinstatement of Pell around the corner, I think it is very prudent of us as a state to really think through for any new partners coming in that have not demonstrated, necessarily being in a student's best interest. What does the state do? What do we do as a group to approve the schools that go inside? We also want to take a look at the technology capacity within the DOC. We know that COVID is something that we are living with probably forever, and there may be times when there are lockdowns in facilities. And we also understand that as people who have been teaching in these facilities for a few years. But what we also know is that as higher ed institutions or partners with higher ed institutions, there are guidelines around seat time, class time, time of instruction, that if we have a lockdown, we've got to make up some sort of way, and being able to work with the DOC on proactively on what a plan like that could look like it would be really helpful. We're also to look at grievance processes. What processes are in place for students to grieve their institutions, whether that's grieving a grade, grieving an instructor, or anything else. What are those processes? What are the processes that DOC has in terms of residents being able to grieve particular situations? Are there ways to streamline or overlap? We also want to look at the approval process for course materials, syllabi, texts, assignments. We know that DOC is concerned with safety and security. We know that higher ed institutions are like, I'm going to teach my course, I'm going to teach my course. And so making sure that we in the higher ed institution understand the process that DOC uses to approve course materials is really helpful. And there may be opportunities for DOC to make some tweaks to their processes, given the input of folks who have been teaching, whether it's on the campus or also inside. Additionally, we want to look at the data partnerships. So the question that's in Public Act 21-132, Section 2 asks if DOC is participating in the state's education workforce and employment longitudinal data system. That's probably a yes or no question. DC Mulligan, do you know if DOC is participating in that?
I don't have that answer off the top. Actually, I'm going to reach out to somebody while we're on so I can answer that question for you before we wrap up.
Perfect. I figure with our 9 items, if there's one that we can answer with a quick yes or no, that is one thing that we can take off our list. The next piece that we'll be examining is space. So looking at the facilities where programs are offered and also facilities where programs may want to be offered. What does space look like in those facilities? Are there non-traditional spaces that can be used as classroom spaces? And if so, what are they, and how are those spaces assigned? And so is there like a rotating roster of who gets priority of first classroom spaces? How was that decided? And really thinking through what that process does look like and what it could look like moving forward. And then finally, looking at some other models used by other states to increase access. As I was mentioning a little bit earlier, I've been fortunate enough to work with a number of states, Ohio, Michigan, Tennessee. I just came back from Texas, Washington State, et cetera, Iowa, Rhode Island. And so I have a good sense of what a lot of states are doing, both states that are larger than Connecticut, smaller than Connecticut, similarly sized to Connecticut. And some are moving forward with a position in the DOC for post-secondary prison director. Iowa actually just made a hire a few weeks ago. And so that person has started, and I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that I'll be able to get in touch with that person and just kind of talk about their experiences, what the expectations are with them in Iowa, and see if there's anything that can relate to what we're doing here in Connecticut. Any questions so far about our goals and objectives? All right.
No.
Excellent. Kevin gave me the thumbs up. All right. So I want to first talk about institutional Title IV eligibility. And what that means is the eligibility of institutions to access federal financial aid. So while there are a number of things that institutions have to do, and Kevin perhaps knows better than most, There are four that I think that we really want to pay attention to at this particular juncture. The first is correspondence courses, and an institution of higher ed can have no more than 50% of its coursework as correspondence. Generally, there are not a lot of those institutions remaining, but it's something that I wanted to raise, especially with COVID, potential lockdowns and things. I know some programs have pivoted to correspondence. Some programs have been able to pivot to virtual instruction, whether it is synchronous or asynchronous. But I just wanted us to keep in mind that this is one of the kind of big things that we want to attend to. Number two is in terms of the student body. You cannot have 50% or more of your student body enrolled in correspondence courses. This is definitely a shift from, the early 90s, and even prior to that. Like, one of the members of my dissertation committee got 3 degrees while he was incarcerated, and he was able to do so through correspondence courses. And so there certainly has been a shift in sort of the presence of correspondence courses, but also how those courses are seen by the education department. Because there's so much room for correspondence courses to not be as rigorous as other modes of instruction, this stipulation is in place. For enrollment, if you have more than 25% of your regular enrolled student body, and that's students enrolled in a degree or credential pathway, if more of 25% of those regular enrolled students are incarcerated, you could be ineligible for Title IV funding or Pell funding. So that means that for institutions, community colleges, state institutions, private institutions, they have to really pay attention to that percentage, especially once Pell is reinstated and they are able to recruit more students. They cannot have more than 25% of their regular enrolled student body be incarcerated. The caveat to that is schools are able to submit a waiver to the education department. And so I'm thinking of Ingram Community College in Alabama, which is 100% incarcerated. They are actually situated within the Alabama DOC. And so 100% of their students are incarcerated, but that was a waiver that they were able to submit documentation that their program is rigorous, and have that approved. And then finally, the secondary credential, if you have more than 50% of your regular enrolled student body without a secondary credential, you could be in danger of losing your Title IV eligibility. From my experience here in Connecticut, it's been very helpful that facility level staff check the secondary credential status for us. It's even more kind of critical for those schools who are leveraging Pell for their students to have that documentation. Kevin, is there anything that, like, in terms of your experiences that have gone really well?
No, I don't have any examples to share right now, Erin, but.
All right. Mark, you have your hand up?
Yes, please. I could use a little bit of help getting anchored to the purpose of this slide. Is the aim here to demonstrate what the DOC must demonstrate to be eligible for? Would you explain what?
Absolutely, that's
yeah.
a great question. So the DOC would not be eligible for Pell funding because they are not a higher ed institution. So these are kind of 4 of the cornerstones that colleges and universities have to adhere to. The way that it relates to the DOC is if we have more lockdowns and perhaps for longer periods of time, and we've got to make pivots to different modes of instruction. So let's say there's a lockdown and there's no movement. So that can also mean that the virtual options that we have in classrooms may not be an option. But as we see here, correspondence is also not a favored option for the ed department. And so it's really contextualizing sort of where the schools are coming from. And DC Mulligan at some point would love to hear what some of the constraints are that are at the DOC level that can help us kind of move forward as we start to have these conversations. I'm going to go to Michelle, and then DC Mulligan, I'll pop over to you.
Thank you so much, Erin. Yes, and I know number 4, the secondary ed showing degree completion at the high school level can be a great challenge, and our liaisons and coordinators and our financial aid people have to do a lot of research and calling, because trying to get that verification can be a challenge, and we haven't been able to have some students enroll because of that. And something else to add about correspondence, we had to halt our Second Chance Pell courses at the start of COVID because higher ed was not allowed to do so. We were partway through the courses, and we all decided as a group in CSCU that we would not proceed because it was too much of a challenge without even technology available. So we did not proceed with correspondence.
Does that clear that up, Mark?
Yeah, it does. So it sounds like the focus here is on the state colleges and universities and other higher education programs that might be applying for Pell funding, and they need to demonstrate compliance with these four. Okay.
Exactly.
You know, what Dr. Coach mentioned was understandable that, you know, there's a discouragement perhaps of an over-reliance on correspondence courses. And I can imagine that when the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, Connecticut Department of Correction had to adjust its policies for education to comply with the public health guidance. I had to imagine that occurred across the country. Was there any flexibility afforded at the federal level to states that are operating higher education programs but needed to make adjustments for a temporary basis under COVID?
Absolutely. And so there were some programs, you know, because we look at the numbers and the percentages are like no more than 50% of coursework can be correspondence. So maybe if there's like 10%, right? And no more, you can't have 50% or more of your student body enrolled in correspondence courses. So if those percentages were lower, then the higher ed institution is still kind of within the guidelines as set forward by the education department. But other DOCs are a little bit further along in their technological capacity. And so they were able to pivot to virtual instruction a little faster than we were. And so that was an option. In some states where they maybe didn't believe COVID was a huge thing, instruction didn't stop. And so some programs were still going in person and doing their instruction. The ed department did have some flexibility, particularly around correspondence courses, but that flexibility is no longer being extended.
I appreciate that. Thank you for pausing to give a little bit of additional instruction and context to the slide. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And so DC Mulligan, would love to hear from the DOC perspective as you're kind of looking at these probably for the first or maybe the second time if you got a chance to look at the PowerPoint yesterday. What are some of the things that higher ed institutions can start thinking about, again, from the DOC perspective in terms of like lockdowns? What are the needs that y'all have in those situations and ways to kind of like think about recouping that time that might be lost?
Well, you already touched on the biggest issue for us right now is just technology. It's you know, starting COVID, we've made some adjustments. So obviously we stopped having any volunteers coming into facilities, you know, to the world at large. For all intents and purposes, COVID is just something they see on TV now, but still in congregate settings, the CDC guidance is still relatively unchanged. So our challenge, and we did start the post-secondary education programs again in person prior to allowing volunteers back in. You know, it's something we're definitely invested in. The hard part is just getting up to speed with the technology to be able to accommodate remote learning when, you know, even if we accommodate staff to come in and teach, they might not want to come in. You know, the reality of it is last fall and into winter was, you know, at one time we had 1,400 staff out in the month of January with COVID. It's not as deadly or resulting in as many hospitalizations as the previous iterations, but the likelihood is, based on the pattern of the last 3 years, that winter's going to be rough again. So it's, you know, I'm kind of the black cloud when it comes to the COVID stuff, but it's forced us in some degree to kind of get a little more up to speed on some of our technology options. We have accommodated some of the Pell programs with remote learning, but it's not, the saturation point isn't there yet to be able to just consistently provide that support for everybody who wants to participate in the program. Nationwide, same as healthcare, corrections, there's a staffing issue. We went through the July retirement tsunami. That's resulted in a lot of these lockdowns. We have a negotiated staffing levels with the unions that when we get below certain staffing levels, the movement has to stop for safety reasons. And that the ability to say, I can't tell you next Wednesday, Willard Cybulski is going to be in lockdown because they don't have enough staff. It happens kind of, as it happens rather organically. It's not predictable. So I don't think we're in a position to say, Dr. Corby, you can't go to McDougal Walker today because we don't have enough staff on second shift to facilitate the program. And for you to be able to say, all right, we're going to do it remotely today. The commissioner is definitely committed to improving our technology, but it costs a lot of money. And the buildings, even our newer buildings, were built in the early 90s and were never intended to support a whole nother type of education. Typically most of them have limited programming space. You've seen McDougal, it's got a great school, but it was intended for USD1 for vocational and GED and adult basic education more so than, so it's been a challenge, but obviously we try and work with the higher ed institutions and as partners. Sometimes it takes a little creative thinking, as you alluded to, finding space that wasn't intended to be used for something. But my hope is, I call them hurdles. They can be overcome. I don't look at it as something that is a hard barrier. It's just something that it's going to take some finesse to get through.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I saw Michelle's hand first and then Kevin.
Thank you very much. Yes, we've been lucky. We have a great relationship with DOC and we've been able to hold Teams meetings and our professors have been able to teach to the classes. We've had technology. The Harvard Foundation for Public Giving gave us a grant to set up technology with the help of DOC in classrooms. So we were able to hold remote classes when they were able to leave their housing units. So we found that was extremely helpful. But I think our next step, they have been deployed tablets and we're looking at maybe we can get the ability to use the tablets to do some of these classes. I think that would be our next step. But we've definitely made strides and we're thankful for the relationship we have in getting some of this technology on the way. But I think the tablets might be our next step to see if it's feasible.
Thank you.
Aaron, if I could just hitchhike on to both the last two comments. It's also been a struggle that not each of the facilities has the same to be able to be offered. So that's a challenge. And it's certainly from an administrative perspective, trying to coordinate with instructors who have to start and stop in different cases based on the facilities and some of those shutdowns. I have a great team right now assembled that was ready to go in a month ago in York, for example, and they're still on a hold pattern because we're not able. So now we're trying to reinvent a schedule, and then each week it's morphed. So certainly we're juggling a lot of different things, and the students are itching for it too. They're waiting for those things to happen in the facilities, and I get it with some of the staffing or some of the COVID issues, but we were trying to meet a lot of different pieces in this big picture.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point, Kevin, that we want to make sure that the institutions, higher ed institutions, are able to deploy their content and programs in adherence to all of the things. And we also want to make sure that DOC is able to operate in a safe and secure fashion, giving staffing levels, et cetera, and kind of find what that middle point is, so that we have a plan right in advance. Like if a lockdown happens, on this day, or if a lockdown happens for this duration, this is how we can think about making up that class time, or however much class time needs to be made up for missing those sessions. I'm just keeping an eye on time. It's 1:46, so we have 14 minutes left. I'm gonna zoom through the really small print that's in the new Ed Department regulations. And obviously, you all as a task force have this PowerPoint so you can read them. There's also the fact sheet, I believe, that Jeannie sent along that really kind of breaks down the 370-page document that Ed Department really sent out and gives the highlights here. The things that I want to highlight for our purposes today is DOC as oversight entity for the process of approving programs. One of the things that I've seen work very well in some other states is that they have formed a consortium of higher ed and prison. So Iowa has one, Massachusetts has one, Georgia has one, and it is that kind of board that actually serves as the approval process. So it's got DOC stakeholders, it has formerly incarcerated students, it's got higher ed institution folks, it's got some business folks, and it's got some community-based organization representation as well. And so maybe this is something that Connecticut can think about. Certainly, again, the federal regulations will defer to DOC as the oversight entity, but what that comes with is the responsibility of all of the other things that are in the regulations, the data, the reporting, all of the things that ultimately will need to go to the Ed Department will have to come out of the DOC. And I know that y'all don't have the capacity for it because the higher ed institutions barely have the capacity for it. And this is what we're supposed to be doing as higher ed institutions. And so DC Mulligan, that's definitely something for you and your colleagues to think and talk through on your end, kind of what the capacity is that you all have, given what the regulations now say is your responsibility, and how to, whether that's something you want to keep in-house, and that becomes part of, the feasibility study for this position for post-secondary prison office, or if this is something that you all think is better suited with a couple of more voices at the table, as some other states have done. If you have initial reactions, happy to hear them, but also understand that this is something that you would need to speak to colleagues about if needed.
Nope, I did. I already took a note to follow up and meet with the team and kind of figure out what solution works best for us. And I'll be reaching out for input from everybody to figure out what the best solution is for us.
Absolutely. Because we understand, and I say we as sort of the higher ed people, the level of reporting that has to happen from higher ed institutions is a lot. So whether it's the stuff that goes to iPads, whether, what ends up at NCES and how do you report it? Who does it go to? What goes to FSA? What goes, what goes here? What goes there? And we know that you all have your own data things that you've got to report to judiciary, probably to your accrediting agencies, and kind of keeping that additional responsibility that comes with tons of training and whatnot may be a lot. So know that we do stand here ready to help. But I think that that's going to be a really big piece of this implementation of Pell reinstatement, is going to be how those responsibilities are divided, who is responsible for the data, what gets reported, how it gets reported. Again, higher ed institutions have their own sets of reporting, but my instinct and the instinct of others who are closer to Capitol Hill than I am, is that there's going to be a little bit more scrutiny on the reinstatement of Pell for incarcerated students in terms of the reporting. Prior reporting from I think it's the Governmental Accountability Office, has not been as, I think, rigorous as folks had wanted, which is kind of what I'm hearing again from DC folks. And so again, I think there will be a little bit more scrutiny on the level of reporting that comes out at the institutional level as well as the state level for financial aid, credits to graduation, credit accumulation rates, et cetera, et cetera. So we definitely, there's a lot to work through, but we are absolutely dedicated to doing that. Additionally, so like number 4 on this page talks a little bit more about the data and the reporting requirements. Number 2 talks about accrediting agencies and the Ed department must approve an institution's first prison education program at the first 2 correctional facilities where the institution operates such programs. I'm not clear on whether current standing programs will have to go through like an extra sort of approval process or like review or renewal process. That's not super clear yet. But once I get insight into that, we'll definitely share with this task force. And number 3 talks about licensure. Initially in the regulations, the Ed department was going to say that no program could be offered if it does not lead to licensure in a particular field. So we know that there are some fields, and I believe Mark and I were on the task force that studied the collateral consequences of conviction. So we know that there are barriers that formerly incarcerated people face, particularly around professional licensure in some fields. So number 3 on the slide says that qualifying prison ed programs do not need to lead to licensure or certification, but if they do, then it should lead to licensure and a professionalization that impacted folks are able to access. And so that would require, I would argue, any new programs that come along that say they want to offer a program that's maybe not already offered through As Nuntuck, which has just like such a great variety of programs. They're going to have to do the background work and research to see if those programs have any sort of discriminatory statutes or legislation for folks who are formerly incarcerated. One of the websites that I have bookmarked because I use it all the time is the National Inventory of Collateral Consequences of Conviction. And I don't remember what the URL is, but if you type in NICCC, it'll come right up and you can search for regulations and legislation by state. You can also look federally. So I would absolutely encourage folks to take a look at that and take a look at what's remaining in Connecticut, because I think the task force that Mark and I were on helped to get rid of some of the things, but there are still very many left that impact formerly incarcerated folks in particular fields. Any questions so far? Oh, and that's what the slide says. Are there any questions? Yes, Mark.
Dr. Corbett, just to, again, on those last 2 slides to distill the essential takeaways, am I understanding correctly that with the reinstatement of Pell Grants, there is funding available for people who are incarcerated, who are enrolled in post-secondary education programs, and you're alerting us that there is a significant increase in reporting requirements to the federal government in order for the population to be eligible for the federal funding. And you're indicating that both the institutions providing the education and the Department of Correction have increased reporting requirements, and you're asking it to. And I think, is that, do I have that train of thought?
Yes, absolutely. So the reporting requirements for the higher ed institutions, if they're already part of the Second Chance Pell experimental site, probably won't be much more because it's stuff that they're already doing and reporting on. But for any new institutions, this will definitely be an increase in reporting to the Ed department. But for DOC, this will all be new kinds of data being collected and kinds of reporting that needs to be done. And so we're hoping that part of this task force deliverables is to kind of outline what that looks like, whether that, again, is housed in the post-secondary prison education office that would be in the DOC, or whether that looks different.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Because if we just sort of let it go as it's written, this would all fall in the DOC.
I see. That's helpful.
Yeah. DC Mulligan, it looked like you may have had a question, but maybe not.
Nope, I did not.
Okay. All right. So I threw together a super tentative timeline, and I'm also keeping an eye on 156. We got 4 minutes, and I think this is like my next to last slide. So I put together super tentative timeline. I'm already looking at it like November 15th, not going to work. So I'm already looking at some things that are going to have to change. And so I'll be reaching out to you all to get some feedback on one, just sort of like the sections that we want to look at in the report. I think Mark brought up a really good point of just like outlining them along the kind of 9 axes that were identified in the Public Act. That makes a ton of sense. And so we'll also just ask your thoughts on what might it look like to have a Connecticut Consortium for Higher Ed in Prison? What are the budget implications and staffing implications for having a post-secondary education director in the DOC? And then probably on the early part of our meetings, kind of ironing out some of the approval protocols for both program selection and course materials. I think that's something DC Mulligan can walk us through maybe at our next conversation, so that higher ed institutions have a super clear idea about how we can move forward. Does that sound okay? Awesome. Oh, and then thank you. Yes, it was my next to the last slide. And the last slide says, thank you. So that brings us to 157. We've got 3 more minutes. Again, I'm happy to take any questions. And if there are any task force members that are like, I want to hear a little bit more about like Title IV eligibility, or I want to hear a little bit more about like financial aid or things like that, I'm happy to have individual conversations with you all. If you have teams that you would like to also have access to this information, happy to, you know, come to where you are and talk about these things. I'm very passionate about this work. As DC Mulligan knows, I've been in McDougall since 2017. Can't really envision myself leaving. So I'm in it for the long haul.
I have a quick question / statement really quick, like 30 seconds. Because so I'm new to this process and everything, but the first thing that pops in my head, and maybe me, you can have an offline conversation. It doesn't need to be with the full task force, but I'm coming from the mental health field, and I teach at a community college and private college. And I know a lot of the concerns and barriers that exist. And I used to go into the prison systems and do alternative to incarceration programs. So my concern is, this is awesome, what we're talking about, and that they will have access to Pell Grant funding again. But how are we going to also support the barriers that exist, the true barriers that exist for these individuals, so then they can be successful? Because their success will only help, you know, the data for DOC. It'll help with everybody, even the higher ed. So I don't know, maybe we could have an offline conversation of how does that fit in this task force, or doesn't it? I don't know.
No, Kaisha, it absolutely does, because part of what higher ed institutions and Michelle and Kevin, you can let me know if I'm incorrect. Part of what these regulations also include is that the same services that are offered for like mental health, advising, tutoring, disability, all of those things that are offered on campus are going to have to be offered inside of the prison. And so we're going to have to work with DOC to make sure that, because again, to also maintain Title IV eligibility, we cannot discriminate in terms of access to students. And so what does that now look like when sometimes in facilities, folks will say you have access to this portion of students, but not this portion? What does that mean for a higher ed institution? Would that be reflected as the higher ed institution is discriminating against a certain group of students? And how does that look? So there's a lot. That's part of why I wanted to sort of give the broader higher ed scope, because I know a lot of times, and I've been guilty of this, it can sound like we're just asking for things just to be asking for them. But many times we are asking for things because if we can't get them, then the higher ed institutions get in trouble. And so we're really just trying to find that middle line of how to provide the provide parity of services and access to inside students as to students who are on the outside. But definitely want to talk to you about mental health stuff. There's a great book about like trauma responsive instruction that I would be happy to just talk with you about because I'm a nerd in that way. And so I'm happy to reach out after our meeting to find a time. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that. We have the tutoring set up, everything like that has to be set up for the students. We also induct them into the Honor Society as well. So we're giving as many opportunities as possible to our students.
Excellent. Mark, I saw you come off mute.
You're so observant. I don't know how you do it. I can only focus on one thing when I'm trying to facilitate. I just would say that, earlier we discussed, changes in access to facilities under the public health, under the COVID pandemic. When there are, lockdowns, I understand them to be largely temporary in response to an altercation or a high risk situation. And, my instinct is that that's beneficial guidance for DOC to provide to anyone seeking to access the facility. If I were a professor seeking to come into a facility, I would want to follow the guidance of the correctional facilities that there is a potential COVID-19 outbreak. Mm-hmm. There is a situation requiring response that could put my physical well-being at risk. So I just really think it'll be important for us to potentially hear from the department, as you requested, Dr. Corbett, at the next meeting about maybe those 9 axes to go through, is their perspective on how those are handled. And I think it would be great, especially if we can add more members to our task force, we can engage in question and answer and discussion about both sides. It's feeling to me there's a relatively small universe of people who are kind of at the administrative level working on higher education within the correctional facilities. And I think we've now elevated up to a task force level, but it feels like there's among the members of this task force pretty close and regular interaction, all in pursuit of the same goal of extending higher education opportunities to people who are incarcerated. So to the extent we can focus those in such a presentation on our next agenda, I think it would be very educational for me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so I'm hoping once we get that date, obviously it will sort of be contingent upon DC Mulligan's availability, as I will likely turn most of the meeting over to him. But absolutely, Mark, this is an equal partnership. We all have to be coming to the table. I was just in Texas, and one of the folks who I greatly admire, they said, we have to find a way to the yes. And so what does that look like? What does that mean? What are the concessions that DOC can make? What are the concessions that higher ed institutions can make? We can be pushy. I know that. I know I can be pushy. I'll speak for myself. DC Mulligan knows I can be a little bit pushy. And so just understanding that, understanding where we are both coming from as systems, I think is absolutely vital to being able to move this forward and really to be kind of on the front line and cutting edge of the work in this country. Quite honestly, I think we have the potential to set a model here. And I'm just hoping that we can all get together and really put our heads together. And so at 2:04, if there is a motion to adjourn, I will accept that.
So moved.
Excellent. A second. Excellent. So the meeting is officially adjourned. You'll get a doodle poll or Calendly poll or something, either from myself or Jeannie, probably Jeannie because she's better at it. And we'll get our next date situated. Kaisha, I will reach out to you so we can have that conversation. And DC Mulligan, if at any time between now and the next meeting, you want to have a chat, happy to do that as well. I always love talking to you.
Appreciate it. Ditto.
Awesome. Awesome. Have a great afternoon, folks, and I'll see you at the next meeting.